They didn't overpower you. They didn't outsmart you. They just spoke louder, and you stayed silent. But deep down, something in you broke. Not because you were weak, but because you knew you could have destroyed them. And you didn't. You chose peace. You swallowed your truth. And now, they think they won. But they have no idea. They've just awakened something far more dangerous than anger. They've awakened a silence that does not submit. It watches. It waits. And when the moment comes, it ends everything. Without saying a word. This isn't about walking away. This is about walking away and still owning the room. So if you've ever been ignored, underestimated, or forced into silence you didn't choose, then listen closely, because starting today, that silence becomes your power. You didn't speak, and somehow it felt like you lost. Even though you were calm, even though you stayed composed, you walked away with a heavy chest. You replayed the moment again and again, thinking of all the things you could have said, all the lines that would have put them in their place. But you said nothing, and now it feels like they won. You wonder why it hurts so much, why silence, even when chosen, feels like surrender. It's because we've been trained to believe that silence means weakness, that if you don't fight back, you've already lost, that not reacting means you were defeated. But that is the illusion. You didn't lose because you stayed silent. You only felt like you did, because you never understood the power of that silence. Silence is not always weakness. It is not always submission. Sometimes, silence is strength in its purest form. Sometimes, silence is control. But only when you know how to use it, because silence without awareness is empty. It leaves you feeling small, powerless, erased. But silence with awareness, that is something else entirely. That is presence. That is restraint. That is power held, not wasted. And the moment you realize this, everything begins to shift. You stop feeling like you have to prove something. You stop needing to be understood. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't even listening. You begin to understand that real strength doesn't scream. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg to be heard. It watches. It waits. It chooses when to speak and when to say nothing at all. And that choice is everything. Next, we go deeper, because silence alone is not enough. To truly win, you have to let go of the need to defend yourself at all. Let me show you why. Why do we feel the need to respond? Why do we rush to defend ourselves, explain ourselves, justify our every move? Because somewhere deep inside, we were taught that silence is dangerous. That if we don't speak, they win. That if we don't explain, we'll be misunderstood. We've been conditioned to think that words are our only defense. That silence means defeat. That reacting means power. But that belief is built on fear. The fear of being judged. The fear of being wrong. The fear of being forgotten. And behind that fear is the ego. The ego cannot stand being questioned, cannot handle being doubted. So it talks, it argues, it reacts, not to bring clarity, but to protect itself from feeling exposed. That's why most arguments are not about truth. They're about control. People don't argue to understand. They argue to dominate. They speak not because they are certain, but because silence would force them to face their own doubt. When you try to justify yourself, you've already lost. Because the moment you feel the need to explain, you are no longer free. You are seeking validation. You are asking for permission to exist. And that is not power. That is submission disguised as strength. Real power does not explain. It does not beg to be accepted. It does not enter battles that do not matter. It stands, quiet, unshaken. The world may misunderstand it, but it remains unmoved. You do not need to defend what is true. The truth does not need your protection. It exists, with or without approval. When you stop explaining, you stop playing their game. You step outside the battlefield. You let others exhaust themselves with noise, while you conserve your strength in stillness. And that is when the shift happens. When your silence is no longer passive, but intentional. No longer empty, but full of presence. And presence is impossible to ignore. In the next part, we go further. We explore what happens when silence is no longer about self-defense, but about self-control. Because when the world expects you to react, your stillness becomes your greatest weapon. There is a kind of silence that is not empty. It is full of awareness. It listens without needing to speak. It observes without needing to be seen. It holds back, not out of fear but out of control. This silence is not passive. It is sharp, precise, unshakable. Because when your mind is quiet, no one can touch you. They can insult you. They can mock you. They can twist your words and try to provoke you. But none of it reaches you, because you're not standing on the surface anymore. You're rooted deeper than their noise can go. Most people react the moment they feel attacked. They raise their voice. They defend their pride. They throw words like weapons, hoping something will land. But what they don't realize is that every reaction is a reveal. Every emotional outburst gives away position. Every word spoken in anger exposes a weakness. But the quiet mind reveals nothing. It is unreadable. It is calm in the face of chaos. And because it reveals nothing, it controls everything. While others spiral into arguments, you remain centered, still, watching. You are no longer a participant in the drama. You become the one observing it all from above. And that alone changes the entire balance of power. Because the reactive mind is always chasing control. But the quiet mind already has it. This is why silence is feared. Not because it hides weakness, but because it hides strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that exists whether others see it or not. And when they realize they can't shake you, when their words don't get a response, when their energy is met with nothing but stillness, that's when they start to fall apart. Not because you attacked, but because you didn't. And that absence speaks louder than anything you could have said. Now, imagine if you could live from that place. Not just sometimes, not just in moments, but always. In the next part, we meet the figure who lives this way. The one who mastered silence and turned it into presence. There is a type of person who doesn't need to speak to be heard, who doesn't need to argue to be respected, who doesn't need to fight to be feared. They walk into a room and something shifts, not because of what they say, but because of what they don't. This is presence, not built through noise, not built through status or image, built through silence, stillness, inner power. This kind of presence cannot be faked, cannot be copied, comes from within, and it radiates without effort. Philosophers called it many things, but one of them gave it a name that still echoes today. The Übermensch, the one who has transcended fear, guilt, and the need for approval. The one who no longer reacts to the world, but shapes it with their existence. This figure does not seek arguments, does not chase validation. They are not interested in being understood. They are interested in being free, and that freedom gives them something rare, total control of their own energy. While others speak to fill silence, they remain still. While others fight to be heard, they observe, they wait, they measure, and when they speak, they say only what must be said. Nothing more, nothing less. Their silence becomes tension. Their gaze becomes pressure. Their presence becomes impossible to ignore. And that is what makes them powerful. They do not impose, but they cannot be moved. They do not react, but they cannot be manipulated. And those around them feel it, even if they don't understand why. Because this kind of presence doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself. And in a world full of noise, distraction, and ego, that presence is rare. And it is unforgettable. Silence is not emptiness. It's not just the absence of sound. It is a presence that shifts the energy in the room. A presence that says, without saying anything, I see everything, and I owe you nothing. Most people don't understand silence. They fear it, because silence makes them feel exposed. When you stop responding, when you offer no defense, no argument, no expression, the other person is left alone with their words. And that's where the unraveling begins. Because most people don't speak to communicate. They speak to protect themselves, to create noise that hides what they don't want seen. But when you respond with nothing, they are forced to sit with their own voice, their own logic, their own discomfort, and that discomfort grows. The human mind hates uncertainty. It hates a vacuum. It starts to create meaning where none is given. Is he judging me? Did she notice the lie? What is he thinking right now? Your silence becomes tension. Your presence becomes pressure. Without lifting a finger, you shift control. And while they search for your reaction, you remain still, grounded, unshaken. This is what makes silence powerful. Not because it hides something, but because it reveals everything. It reveals the fear behind their confidence, the insecurity behind their arrogance, the desperation behind their control. And you said nothing, because true silence isn't just quiet, it's alive. It sees everything, and it gives away nothing. The quieter you are, the louder their internal chaos becomes. And if you hold that silence, if you choose not to give them the response they crave, they begin to crumble under their own weight. Not because you attacked, but because you refused to defend. Most people don't know how to exist without control. They rely on reactions. They measure their power by how others respond. So when you don't respond, when you give them nothing, they begin to lose grip. Silence removes the structure they depend on. It takes away the feedback they use to adjust, manipulate, and perform. Now they are alone with themselves. And that's when the mind turns on itself. Their confidence begins to shake. Their words lose rhythm. Their voice becomes uncertain. They begin to project. They wonder what you're thinking. They invent stories to explain your silence. Because silence in their mind becomes judgment. It becomes resistance. It becomes a mirror. And that mirror shows them what they tried to hide. The brain doesn't process silence as nothing. It processes it as danger. The amygdala, the part responsible for fear, lights up. Their body reacts before their logic can step in. Their heartbeat changes. Their breathing tightens. They feel exposed, vulnerable, unsure. And all you did was say nothing. That's why silence is so powerful. Because it triggers what words cannot. It cuts past the surface. It goes underneath the argument. And it strikes the root. Especially in the presence of manipulators. People who thrive on emotional reactions. They need your response to stay in control. But if you don't give it to them, they lose their script. They lose their rhythm. They lose their mask. Without your reaction, there is no performance. Without your energy, there is no manipulation. And they panic, because their power was never real. It only existed in your response. Silence takes that away. But there's something even deeper. Silence doesn't just affect the manipulator. It stirs something inside you as well. Because staying silent when everything in you wants to speak requires strength. It means standing in the discomfort, holding the tension, facing the voice inside that says, you have to say something, and choosing not to. That choice is difficult. It goes against your instincts, against your conditioning, against the fear of being misunderstood. But that's what makes it powerful. It is not weakness. It is mastery. It is the moment when you stop being pulled by the world and start choosing how you respond to it. The person who can hold their silence under pressure cannot be controlled, cannot be read, cannot be moved, because they are no longer playing anyone else's game. And that is when silence stops being a shield and becomes a weapon. But silence only becomes power when it's used with intention. Not as escape, not as avoidance, but as precision. It is not about being quiet for the sake of quiet. It is about knowing why you're quiet, and what that quiet is doing. The first skill is resistance. Staying silent when your ego is screaming to speak. When your pride is burning for a comeback. When your instincts want to react. That is where the strength is tested. Because silence in those moments is not passive. It is violent in its control. It is discipline turned into presence. And every second you hold it, you reclaim power. The second skill is observation. While others fill the air with noise, you watch, you listen, you gather what they didn't mean to reveal, their insecurities, their contradictions, their tells, and you store them, because if you ever decide to speak, you won't be guessing, you'll be exact, you'll be surgical. Your words will land not because they are many, but because they are precise. That's what makes silence terrifying. People know you're seeing something they missed, and they don't know what you'll do with it. The third skill is time. Let the silence stretch. Let it breathe. Let the other person squirm in it. Because silence is not just pause. It's pressure. And pressure, when held, breaks things. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to interrupt. You just hold your silence, and their mind begins to fracture under its own weight. They second-guess themselves. They wonder what they said wrong. They search for your response, and find none. And in that space, their image starts to collapse. The fourth skill is unpredictability. When you master silence, people can no longer read you. You become unknown, and the unknown is always feared. They don't know when you'll speak, or if you'll speak. They don't know what you're thinking, or what you'll do next. And that uncertainty shifts the balance. Suddenly, they're cautious. They speak slower. They check themselves. Because your silence is now the dominant energy in the room. You are no longer responding to their reality. They are adjusting to yours. And you did that by saying nothing. But never confuse this silence with weakness. This is not silence that retreats. It is silence that prepares, that positions, that waits for the moment where one word ends everything. Not because it's aggressive, not because it's loud, but because it's real, and it can't be denied. That's the silence that shifts power, the silence that rewrites the room. But silence isn't always a weapon. Sometimes it becomes a prison, when it's no longer chosen, but forced. When you stay silent not out of strength, but because you've forgotten your voice. That kind of silence doesn't feel powerful. Feels heavy. Feels like disappearing. You tell yourself you're keeping the peace. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight. You tell yourself you're being mature. But inside, it hurts. Because deep down, you know something is wrong. You're swallowing your truth. You're shrinking in moments when you should be standing. You're nodding while your soul is screaming. And little by little, you begin to lose yourself. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, quietly. You stop setting boundaries. You let others take more than they should. You start to believe that your silence is the only thing keeping things from falling apart. But here's the truth. That isn't peace. That's self-erasure. That's a silence built on fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being rejected. And those who notice it will use it. They will fill the space you leave empty. They will impose their will, their opinions, their desires, and you will step aside quietly thinking you're doing the right thing. But you are not keeping harmony. You are surrendering. You're giving away your voice, your space, your power, one silent moment at a time. And the worst part, you're convincing yourself it's strength. You've been taught that silence is maturity, that silence is humility, that silence is wisdom. But sometimes, silence is submission. Sometimes, silence is self-betrayal wrapped in politeness. And that is the silence that breaks you. Not loudly, but slowly. That's when silence becomes dangerous. Not for others, but for you. Because you're no longer choosing it. It's being chosen for you. By fear. By patterns. By the belief that your voice is too much. But it's not. The world taught you to be agreeable. To be quiet. To be accommodating. But the truth is, you weren't born to be invisible. You weren't born to exist only in the space others allow. There comes a point when your silence is no longer peaceful. It's no longer strength. It's a cage. And the only way out is to remember who you are underneath it. You don't escape the cage by shouting. You escape it by waking up. By realizing you were never meant to live on your knees, even in silence. Because real silence doesn't hide. It holds. It doesn't shrink to avoid conflict. It expands to carry truth. You begin to reclaim it when you stop apologizing for your presence. When you stop shrinking in the face of other people's loudness. When you stop explaining who you are just to make others comfortable. You are not here to play small. You are not here to keep the peace at the cost of your soul. True silence is not the absence of voice. It is the presence of self. It's the kind of silence that fills the room, that commands without needing to convince, that makes others pause. Not because you demanded it, but because your energy shifted everything around you. This is the silence of power, the silence of alignment, the silence of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. And it starts with one choice, the decision to stop participating in your own erasure, to stop calling fear peace, to stop calling passivity strength. You are not strong because you avoid conflict. You are strong when you can enter it and choose stillness anyway, not because you're afraid, but because you're in control. You become the kind of person who no longer needs to defend, explain, or justify. You listen deeply. You observe clearly. You respond only when it's time. And when you do, you speak with a voice shaped by silence. One word, when it finally comes, lands with the weight of truth. Not because you forced it, but because you earned it. This is the silence that changes things. It does not ask for respect, commands it, not through arrogance, not through fear, but through presence, through self-mastery, through unshakable inner clarity. You become your own anchor, and in a world full of noise, you become the calm no one can ignore. Silence, when fully mastered, is no longer a tactic. It becomes identity. It becomes a state of being. You no longer use silence. You are silence. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know that most things don't need to be said. You are no longer caught in other people's chaos. You are no longer triggered by their noise. You are no longer pulled into arguments that serve no purpose. You've risen above the need to be right, above the urge to be seen, above the hunger to be understood by those who cannot understand themselves. You've stepped outside the game, and now you shape the room just by standing in it. This is the silence of the self-possessed, the silence of the deeply grounded, the silence of the one who has already won, long before the battle begins. You don't need to shout. You don't need to prove. You don't need to take up space, because you are the space. This is the silence that cannot be manipulated, cannot be shaken. It cannot be owned. It is the silence of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Someone who has faced their own mind and made peace with what they found there. Someone who no longer seeks validation because they have become the source of it. And in this place, you are untouchable. People will feel it when you walk in. They won't know what it is, but they'll feel it. They'll speak less. They'll listen more. They'll adjust to the gravity of your presence. Because this is not silence born from fear. This is silence born from mastery. And in a world that worships noise, the one who speaks with silence becomes unforgettable. So now you choose. You can keep living the silence that erases you, or you can become the silence that defines you. The one that stands unshaken. The one that sees everything. The one that leads without needing to be followed. This silence is not absence. It is presence. Not surrender, but control. Not emptiness, but depth. And once you find it, you will never need to raise your voice again. If this spoke to something deep in you, don't let it fade. Take a moment, breathe, and if you're ready to step into this kind of power, subscribe to the channel. Click the like button if this silence felt louder than words, and leave a comment below, not for me, but as a commitment to yourself. Say it clearly, I choose the silence that commands respect, because even a few words can mark the beginning of something far greater.